they begin looting Poland. And then after the war, France, other parts of Europe, the systematic looting of every country they occupied. And in this book, he documents trainloads of sausage and butter and cheese coming in from Poland and Ukraine, wine and goods from France, emptying all of the stores. All the silk stockings of Paris brought back to the Reich by German soldiers, by occupation soldiers, and even, so it's really a fabulously good book. He's a very good financial historian. They forced the occupied countries to pay the cost of their own occupation. German soldiers were not paid in German money. They were paid in what's called Reichskreditkassen, RKK certificates, that could not legally be introduced into Germany itself. It was illegal. They could only be paid in the occupied country. They were exchangeable at fixed exchange rates in terms of the local currency, the drachma, or the zloty, or the franc, or whatever it happened to be. Which means they were able to export their inflation. They devalued and destroyed the currencies of all of the occupied countries. A really quite brilliant predatory system of looting other people for the benefit of the supporters of the German state. Now, less malignant or more benign forms of this also spread throughout Europe. It's a very good book I highly recommend by Shari Berman called The Primacy of Politics. And she argues, she's an advocate of the welfare state, she argues that in fact social democracy or welfare state ideology and fascism, National Socialism, and communism draw from the same well, the same common principles, and she calls it the primacy of politics, seeing the state and political life as primary rather than life in church, or synagogue, or business association, or neighborhood, or other forms of human association, that it's the state that is primary. And also even in the United States, in a democratic form, the establishment of new social rights. Roosevelt, in a famous speech in 1944, argued that there was a second Bill of Rights. The first one is actually written down in the Constitution, the right to freedom of speech, assembly, worship, petition, for redress of grievances, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to trial by jury, and so on and so forth. And now a second Bill of Rights, and this second Bill of Rights was to include the right to a job that pays a good wage, and farms, factories, and mines of the nation, the right to medical care, the right to education, and so on and so forth. But these are all now new rights that had an equal standing with the rights that are actually in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So a kind of a welfare state formulation in the American context. Let me step back a little bit from history and political economy, talk a little bit about political theory or moral theory. There's a very important book by now deceased Harvard professor John Rawls called The Theory of Justice. It's actually a very, very significant book. If you're interested in these questions, it's worth reading. To his great credit, Rawls explains his own book is staggeringly boring. And in the introduction, he tells you what chapters to read if you really want to get the core of his message. It is really a very dull book. It's dull or boring because he tries to write in a very precise way. I admire what he tried to do. But in writing precisely, he repeats the same language over and over and over. So if you're interested in the book, pay attention to his introduction. He says, if you really want the key, read these chapters. You skip about 600 pages of mind-numbing PDF. I've read this book cover to cover 3 times. At the end, I had to struggle with the almost overpowering desire to kill myself. It was so dull. But that said, it's important, and he did try to bring about a systematic discussion of what is justice. What is a just social order? And he accomplished something. He returned the idea of justice somehow to modern political discourse. It had fallen out. I admired this book in general, besides its tedium. He arrives at a principle he calls the difference principle, if you've heard that, which is if we start from a baseline that equality is naturally justified, he says, well, could there be any inequalities that would be justified? And he says, well, if the inequality was to the advantage of everyone, including the least well-off member of the group, how could you object? If everybody is made better off, including the least well-off member, what objection could there be to it? So he says that we would allow inequalities provided that they meet that test. Interesting approach. But it provides what we could call a pattern theory of distribution, that ordering in society is just if it fits this pattern. Robert Nozick, one of his colleagues at Harvard, offered a criticism of that in his book, Anarchy, State, Utopia. This book had lots of other things in it as well, but most people only read one chapter. But in fact, it's a fun book. I will mention, find his views more congenial. I will also say it is undeniably the case, it's a much more fun book to read. It's interesting, it's playful, he raises questions and doesn't answer them, whereas Rawls finds this almost unthinkable. If he raises the question, it's worth another 100 pages to talk about it. And Nozick, as playfully, says that's an interesting thought. Maybe someone should pursue this. So it's a fun book. But in it, he raises a challenge to Rawls that has become rather famous. It's an extended discussion. He says to realize one of these patterns, the state must continually interfere to stop people from transferring resources as they wish. He gives an example. It's called the Wilt Chamberlain example, after a very famous basketball player was popular and well known at the time, and very, very wealthy, and a truly tremendous athlete. People were happy to spend their money to see him be an athlete and do just amazing things on the basketball court. And he said, well, if you do that, he's going to have a lot more money than the rest of us have. But everyone freely transferred their equal shares to him, and yet it's going to generate this huge inequality. In order to realize another pattern, you're going to have to interfere with what people chose to do, with what was by presumption theirs. Rawls vigorously rejects this thesis, and in another book that's a little bit less boring, called Political Liberalism, he said that's not true. There's something a little amusing about this. As far as I can tell, John Rawls never mentioned the name of Robert Nozick in print, his most famous critic, who had the office down the hall from him at Harvard. So you can imagine how fun the faculty meetings must have been at Harvard University. He just said, it's not true. Some have argued. It has been said. Never ever, as far as I can tell, did he specifically say who said it or where. He just told he was seething with anger that this other professor at his own university had criticized. He says, there are no unannounced and unpredictable interference with seated citizens' expectations and acquisitions under the theory of justice he articulates. I read these books all quite carefully. What was striking was in the same book, he concedes exactly Nozick's point. Fair background justice may exist at one time and be gradually undermined, even though no one acts unfairly when their conduct is judged by the rules that apply to transactions. The tendencies for background justice be eroded even when individuals act fairly. The overall result of separate and independent transactions is away from and not toward background justice. In other words, even though everybody acted fairly and in accordance with justice, the outcome was unjust and has to be rearranged. That's Nozick's point. He acknowledged it, he conceded it, but he never acknowledged it. In fact, Nozick had it quite right. It's very significant also because you'll notice that when people talk about social justice, this is what they're talking about. That the outcome was unjust, the social outcome. But there's a little clue. Social justice isn't the same as justice. They're two different things. By definition, people acted justly. Every element of this was just, but the outcome was not. It was social injustice. So social justice and justice are different concepts, although often they're treated as if somehow they're interchangeable. It really is a rejection of the principle of a rule-based community or a system based on principles of justice. So I think it effectively left Nozick's point unanswered. Let's go back, though, to some political economy and think about the structuring of a pyramid scheme or a pay-as-you-go system. They tend to generate over time what are called fiscal imbalances. The fiscal imbalance refers to the present value of all the future differentials between what will be received in taxes and what must be expended under current law. So for every year, this is what's going to be received, and this is what current law requires to be spent. You're going to build up a huge amount. It's discounted by the rate of interest, so if it's $100 in 10 years, it does not have the same value as $100 now. But nonetheless, we can generate a present value for that. So everyone see why money in the future has a present value. That's what interest rates help us to understand. So the fiscal imbalance is the difference, the present value of the difference projected into the future of all future and present tax receipts and all present and future expenditures required under current law. Now, Jagadish Gokhale, who's one of the world's experts on these questions, has attempted to calculate this, and these are very conservative numbers. It's a few years old, it's gotten worse. He's busy recalculating them now. For the U.S., the fiscal imbalance is a minimum of $80 trillion. Now, to understand what that means, that's not the same as the budget deficit. What it means is, this is the amount of money that the U.S. government would have to have today invested in real assets, earning interest, at least the rate of interest that the government is paying on its debt in order to finance the differential between tax receipts and expenditures. Again, just to be very clear, that's in addition to all the taxes being collected. We don't have $80 trillion invested to pay that. For the European Union, as a whole, 53 trillion euros, which is calculated slightly different because there's only a 50-year time horizon on the data available from Eurostat, from the European Union mechanism. And calculating it by country in the European Union, Estonia is by far the best. This is the one that the movement constantly mocks and makes fun of. They actually have been growing, having addressed their fiscal problems. Down to Greece and Malta. This is actually the amount of money, so 12.8% for Malta, that would have to be extracted every year from gross domestic product and assigned 100% to finance this differential. That's not a 12.8% increase in your taxes. If you calculate it into the tax increase on taxable wages, it's about 38% increase over present taxes. So this is really quite a staggering sum. It should sober us up. But just to make you feel really depressed, it's not just the unfunded liabilities. Most of the discussion has been on intergenerational transfers, that is to say generations within, transfers within some generation. Tax the rich, the 1% and the 99% and all that sort of thing. We're going to soak the rich to pay for all these things. There's actually a much larger transfer that almost no one has talked about, and it should be relevant to many of the people in this room. Intergenerational transfers. What's the transfer from young people to older people? And Gokhale estimated about $60 trillion transfer that is going on as we speak, from people who are very young to their elders. That includes me. I am the recipient of this. Huge amounts of money are being transferred, in effect, to me, people of my generational cohort, from very young people.